millennials are viewed by many people, or they call themselves, the lazy generation. And she said, you know, it's interesting. My generation we're lazy, we're tired, we're fatigued. And I actually started my book because of an experience I had with a millennial canceling an interview because she just didn't have enough energy to come into work.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Welcome back to the Empowering Neurologist. You know, one of the most common complaints that we get as physicians from patients is the notion that people are just pooped out. They're tired. They're get up and go, got up and left. They just don't have energy. And, you know, what is the quick fix? The quick fix is drinking a lot of coffee or drinking energy drinks as if that's going to help them with energy. We really have to get to the source of the problem. Why are people so fatigued? What's going on with their bioenergetics that can be fixed and help them feel better? Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Gundry. He's been on the program before. His new book is called The Energy Paradox, and it addresses exactly this puzzle, this conundrum that we face. Why are people so tired? Why are they so fatigued? And he really takes us back to square one. What is energetics all about in the human body? And most importantly, how can we fix it? Let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. Gundry. Dr. Stephen Gundry is a cardiothoracic surgeon and a pioneer in nutrition, as well as medical director at the International Heart and Lung Institute Center for Restorative Medicine. He has spent the last 2 decades studying the microbiome and now helps patients use diet and nutrition as a key form of treatment. He is the author of many popular New York Times best-selling books. We've talked about them on the program before, including The Plant Paradox, The Plant Paradox Cookbook, and The Longevity Paradox, How to Die Young at a Ripe Old Age. Great title. And his most recent book, The Energy Paradox, What to Do When Your Get Up and Go Has Got Up and Gone, is an exciting book just released. Dr. Gundry is also the founder of Gundry MD, a line of wellness products and supplements. 20 years ago, Dr. Gundry decided to prevent health-related issues. He retired as a cardiologist to teach patients how to eat, guiding them on how to get ahead of the problem, not fixing it after the fact. He shifted towards a more proactive approach to health through food and diet changes, and he is the host of the Dr. Gundry podcast. So we're real excited to spend some time again with Dr. Gundry. Let's get right to the podcast. Hello, Dr. Gundry. How are you doing?
David, great to see you again. Thanks for having me.
I think our last in-person meeting was probably in Austin, Texas, I think backstage, wasn't it?
Yeah, it actually was. And you were telling me that in the future at that meeting, never wear a coat and tie. You got to, kind of dress down a bit.
Oh, that was Paleo FX.
Oh,
right?
It was Paleo FX.
You got to dress like a caveman.
Yeah, exactly.
But I have to say, over the years, I have, really indicated that the notion, their fundamental principle of really doing our best to communicate appropriately with our genome is, at least that idea really does make a lot of sense.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, so much of our disease, as you've seen, is really because of this evolutionary environmental mismatch. I mean, the development of the agricultural monsters that we see and all the changes to our food. I mean, your new book is really an awful lot about that, about how we are not catering to our mitochondria and people are so fatigued.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. We've done a great job of literally creating rush hour in our mitochondria almost 24 hours a day now, and it's really no wonder that we're just kind of a fatigued nation. It surprises even me how tired we all are.
Well, I was very taken in the early part of your book where you were talking about that you're still working 6 hours a day in your, you said in your seventh
6 days a
decade.
week.
Yeah, 6 days a week, right? And you're in your seventh decade. You weren't any more specific than that. And that's great. I mean, you're still making it happen. And I guess you're walking the talk.
Yeah, I actually work 7 days a week. I see patients 6 days a week, and on Fridays I'm at Gundry MD, my supplement and food company. Yeah, it's like I'm still luckily kind of a kid in a candy store, and I just I need to keep seeing patients because everyone I see I learn from. And in my past books, I've literally giving all the credit of what I've learned in the last 20 odd years doing restorative medicine to having my patients be my laboratory. And
I've often said that. They teach us a heck of a lot more than we teach them. You stated, let me make sure I get it correct, that around 70% of the patients that you are seeing these days are suffering from an autoimmune issue. I mean, maybe not one
correct.
of the classics, but they're suffering, let's say, from autoimmunity. Walk us through what that means and what are the implications of that.
Yeah, so you're right. About 70% of my patients have a recognized autoimmune disease, or we discover an autoimmune disease in the process of their workup. But I think the longer I've been doing this, the more I think that we'll come to think of almost all diseases, like Hippocrates said 2,500 years ago, as beginning in the gut. And to take that one step further, as I do in the book, that all diseases will begin with a leaky gut. And I now think that, for instance, heart disease, where I started with coronary artery disease, is actually an autoimmune attack on the surface of our blood vessels. That is, in turn, prompted primarily by our immune system being activated by a leaky gut. And, if you had asked me this 20 years ago when I first started this, I would have been very skeptical. But now, thanks to work with Dr. Fasano, who's now at Harvard, and others, I think that the tide is really turning, that we can trace almost all of our current problems, brain, as you know, to what's happening in the gut. And it's not a pretty picture.
Well, I think so much comes down to the integrity of the gut lining. I mean, we're talking one cell thick that, if you are correct, is really the arbiter of health versus disease by and large. I mean, there's certainly conditions that may not relate to it, but by and large, the chronic degenerative conditions
Correct.
that are what we focus on may well come down to one cellular level membrane or blockage or an area of protection for the rest of the body in terms of keeping the rest of our systemic circulation in the body sterile, at least as it relates to certain chemicals that can enhance or change our immune response. And certainly these days, a balanced immune system is a prize to have, isn't it?
Yeah, it's. I think if nothing that COVID has taught us besides, people with pre-existing conditions are the setup for COVID. And when you then go backwards and look at, well, what are pre-existing conditions, they almost universally can be traced to a dysbiotic gut microbiome and a leaky gut and a hyperactivated immune system. And it's this hyperactive immune system, like I talk about in the book, 70-80% of our immune system, our white blood cells, are concentrated around the wall of our gut. And they're there for a very good reason, because in general, that's where the mischief is going to come through, as you point out. And I think two things happen. Number one, our immune system is down in the gut, almost distracted from taking care of business up in our nose, up in our airways, and because the action is down below. That's number one. But number two, when you do get an invader like COVID-19, our immune system is on hyper alert, and we get this cytokine storm that, it's just devastating to the vast majority of people who catch COVID-19. And I use the example for my patients. Way back when, you and I, when we were growing up, there really were not peanut allergies. Everybody brought peanut butter and jelly to school. People eat peanuts. Nobody had EpiPens to go to school. And in my first book, long ago, there's actually a really cool paper that 95% of us carry a preformed antibody, are born with a preformed antibody to the peanut lectin. And this is not a lectin discussion, but none of us reacted to that many, many years ago. And that's because our microbiome taught our immune system that these are the things you need to worry about, these are the things you really don't need to worry about. Plus, our gut wasn't leaky, so our immune system wasn't activated. Now, however, the vast majority of patients that I see, and probably the vast majority of us, have a horrible microbiome that's been decimated, like we talk about in the book, and we have leaky gut. So our immune system is hyperactivated. So now it sees a somewhat innocent peanut lectin, an antigen that it does have a receptor for, and goes crazy. And I think that's a really good way of explaining the fundamental difference between when you and I were growing up without exposure to glyphosate, which is now one of my 7 deadly energy disruptors, and widespread antibiotic use. These things didn't happen to us. Now they're universal.
Well, I will say it's certainly very exciting and supportive that science has come along to be as validating as it is now with reference to the relationships that you're describing. You know, back when I wrote Brain Maker and described gut permeability issues related to inflammation, related to risk for certain conditions, how we found markers of this permeability issue with antibodies towards lipopolysaccharide, elevated in autism and multiple sclerosis, in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, in Alzheimer's. Oh my gosh, the pushback was really pretty profound. But now I think what you're saying is that pretty well universally, as it relates to these chronic degenerative, may I say, inflammatory conditions, that people are really getting the message that, you know, pioneers like Dr. Fasano, you are correct, have really opened a door for us from not just an understanding perspective, but I think in the long run, as your book makes so clear, from a therapeutic perspective. Okay, we get it. We understand that this is the central player here, or a central player, that then dysregulates, downregulates the functionality of our energy producer mitochondria. And that it opens the door for interventions to say, okay, we get the problem, let's fix it. Let's do the right thing. And that's what's so great about your book, because, you know, the first part lays out the science. And it's a little technical, but I think for readers who've been following your work and others over the years, they kind of get what the mitochondria do. They kind of understand this notion of hyperinflammatory states in the human body brought on by gut permeability, brought on by dysbiosis, brought on by exposure to chemicals like glyphosate, et cetera. So you really did a great job not only connecting the dots from a mechanistic perspective, but really taking the reader by the hand and saying, okay, you got this, here's what you got to do. And I think that's really very valuable. So you made a point early in the book that the energy issues that people are suffering from are related at their core to this process of inflammation. How do we get from inflammation, let's say brought on by hyperpermeability of the gut lining, how do we get from that inflammation to disruption of our ability to be energetic?
Well, I think early on in the book, I bring up the study that was done by Duke University researchers a few years ago, looking at the Hadzas, one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes in Tanzania, and comparing their energy expenditure to desk workers, sedentary desk workers. And the original hypothesis that they had was, wow, we're going to look at these Hadzas. The men walk 8 to 10 miles every day hunting. The women are walking 3 to 5 miles every day digging tubers, gathering berries, and they're lean, they're fit, they're incredibly healthy, they don't have chronic diseases. And we're going to bet that their energy expenditure is pretty doggone high because, look what they do. And lo and behold, so they compare them to office workers. And lo and behold, the energy expenditure of the office workers was virtually identical to the Hadza's. And you and I in research know that when our hypothesis isn't backed up by research, sometimes we'll make up a new hypothesis to try and explain it. And their new explanation was, well, everybody has the same energy expenditure, and that's what humans do. Now, to me, that didn't pass the sniff test. And I'm going, no, that can't be. Yes, I agree that these two groups are expending the same amount of energy, but what are they expending it on? And so when you look at these desk workers, they have very elevated levels of inflammation. And inflammation at its core is activation of our white blood cells. And there literally are troops, and troops at any war need a lot of supplies. And what I propose, and I think I'm right about this, is we have so much need for fuel for this ongoing chronic inflammation that we take the fuel that our muscles would ordinarily need, our brain, as you know, would ordinarily need, and it's diverted. We ration that fuel to our inflammatory troops. And I think that's why their observation is true, that yes, the overall energy expenditure was the same, but it was being used for in a way, futile purpose. And
Well, I think there's plenty of support for that idea. We know that in the chronic immune state, there is a deficiency of NAD, intracellular NAD, within immune cells, and hence the push to restore intracellular NAD. You talked about that quite later in the book
yeah,
with your recommendation, I think, of nicotinamide riboside. Actually mentioning the work of Dr. David Sinclair, who uses, because he has access to it, nicotinamide mononucleotide. He actually talked about that on our podcast. But
and he uses a lot of it. I can't afford it.
well, I don't think affording is the issue there. I think anyway, for another time. But that said, I think that there's a lot of, call it, wasted energy in just keeping the flame of inflammation, exactly what the word means, where it comes from, going. And I tend to think that that's correct. I think on the upper right side page, after you mentioned this about the Hadza, you said, and I know this is going to raise a lot of eyebrows, but um, there's this whole notion that you're right, that they're active, and therefore they should be using a lot more calories. But interestingly, I think it does help us get back to the microbiome a little bit, because of the microbiomes that have been studied on the planet, I think the Hadza might be whose microbiome has been studied the most,
Right.
the extent that it is so diverse and so rich in certain uh, organisms that are not designed for, but help to reduce inflammation and maintain gut wall integrity, I might add,
Yes.
that there are some enterprising individuals who are trying to market Hadza poop for fecal microbial transplant. And it's an interesting world, but your notion then that inflammation then is brought about by this whole process and therefore is energy consumptive, I think you make a good point. And I think that the fact that inflammation then goes on to further downstream affect the functionality of mitochondria by the direct effect of inflammation, the indirect effect of these inflammatory cytokines on other immune cells and their effect on mitochondria, and ultimately through upregulation of oxidative stress mediators, then further compromises our ability to produce energy and basically feel energetic.
Yeah. Recently I was on a podcast with a millennial who, and I'll mention the podcast. It's called I Suck at Life. And
What a great name, I guess.
yeah, and well, the point she was making, and the reason she had me on, is that millennials are viewed by many people, or they call themselves the lazy generation. And she said, it's interesting. My generation we're lazy, we're tired, we're fatigued. And I actually started my book because of an experience I had with a millennial canceling an interview because she just didn't have enough energy to come into work. And I'm going, what do you
I,
mean?
I think the term that she used in your book was, I don't have it in me.
I don't have it in me. That's exactly right. And and that stuck with me for several days. And I'm going, I don't get it. And I think when I started talking with this young lady on her podcast, I realized that, the millennials are actually the first full generation that have been exposed to Roundup in everything, glyphosate. They're the second generation that now has been exposed to widespread broad spectrum antibiotics in everything, in our food, in our animals. And they are one of the first generations to be constantly exposed to processed and ultra processed foods, which I go into as another major energy disruptor. And talking to her just kind of brought it home. Is, my gosh, we've produced this lazy generation from our environment, what they've been exposed to, the foods they've been exposed to, and they are actually the poster childs for what I'm writing about in the energy paradox.
One of the things you call out as it relates to that generation is their reliance upon so-called energy drinks. So what does it mean, an energy drink, and why is that really an incredibly terrible misnomer?
Well, there's several things. Speaking of the Hodses, long ago, a few generations ago, we ate whole foods whole. And in the process of eating whole foods, the process of breaking down those foods into individual carbohydrate molecules, individual amino acids, individual fatty acids, was a extended process. And in general, these foods would arrive for processing into energy at our mitochondria in a slow fashion. Glucose would arrive first, protein would take longer to digest, amino acids would arrive second, and fat, as most of us know, takes a very circuitous route to reach our mitochondria. It actually is absorbed through our lymphatic system rather than directly into our bloodstream. So these things arrive at mitochondria actually at varying time periods. And mitochondria are really good at making energy from glucose. They're really good from making energy out of amino acids, and they're really good out of using free fatty acids, but it's a slightly different process for each. Now, however, with our energy drinks, with our smoothies, with our energy bars, we have processed sugars, amino acids, and fats into wildly rapidly absorbing forms without any fiber associated with it. And so what I propose to people is that we've literally created, with these modern foods, rush hour traffic jam at our mitochondria. And living in the LA area, I can assure you that rush hour in the LA area now occupies 16 hours a day. And during rush hour, nothing moves. And one thing we've learned in COVID was it's a wonderful thing when nobody's going to work because things actually move. And it was actually a real eye-opener to see just what a traffic jam, tons of potentially energy-producing material, arriving simultaneously on a freeway, which I liken to a mitochondria, and the difference with COVID. So I think we've literally produced, gridlock in our mitochondria by these energy-producing foods that didn't exist a generation ago.
25 years ago, I described Alzheimer's disease as an acquired mitochondriopathy. This is in the day when we had to learn about the hereditary mitochondriopathy or mitochondrial diseases like Kern-Sayre, progressive external ophthalmoplegia, all these things you had to know only for your boards, and then you could forget them. But we began noticing, in fact, exactly what you're saying, that the functionality of mitochondria was being compromised in this and other chronic degenerative conditions. But we couldn't really measure it, much as we cannot, as you talked about in the book, we can't really measure fatigue, quantify it, and therefore it can't be remedied simplistically. You talk about that, actually. You talk about how you can measure blood pressure, you can measure blood sugar, you measure cholesterol, and therefore can target it because you can get feedback using your medication and then getting a lab test. But there's a lot of open territory in terms of saying that I feel fatigued, or I get up and got up and left, or I'm not cognitively where I think I need to be, and I'm relying on coffee several times a day to get through the day. So, it's multifactorial, but at the end of the day, it does come down to mitochondria just not being given what they need, being threatened by many of the things you've mentioned, including changes in the microbiome. And interestingly, when we talk about the microbiome, generally, we're referring to the gut bacteria. And as many of our viewers would know, we've talked about this before, there is the theory that mitochondria were at one point free living bacteria that took up residence in what are now eukaryotic cells, and therefore we should, and I've often said this, we should consider our mitochondria, they have their unique genome, to be part of our microbiome because they've taken up residence within our bodies. So, having said that, what are some of the biggest threats then to our mitochondria these days? I mean, you mentioned glyphosate, but what are we doing in terms of others of our lifestyle choices to so threaten our mitochondria?
Yeah, I think this is actually another really exciting point in the book. Talk about postbiotics. And you're right, I and others are pretty convinced that mitochondria are ancient engulfed bacteria about 2 billion years ago. And interestingly, as most people probably know, mitochondria have their own DNA, and we inherit our mitochondrial DNA from our mother. Dads contribute nothing, as many women may think.
We contribute later on, though.
So, and the mother, in general, contributes the initial microbiome. And so there's a thought that there is a sisterhood, and I've written about this in my books, between the microbiome, the bacterial microbiome, and the bacterial mitochondria. And years ago, I used to, back before COVID, present at the major microbiota meeting in Paris every year. And the chairman of that meeting, Marvin Eades, we'd talk, and he says, there is a communication system between the microbiome and the mitochondria. There has to be. And I said, what are you talking about? And he says, they send text messages to each other. He says, they're sisters. And I said, well, why haven't we discovered that? And he said, we just haven't figured out how to measure it yet. And he says, you watch. Well, he was absolutely right. And this was, I don't know, 12 years ago. So that communication system between the microbiome and the mitochondria has been discovered. And as you probably know, one of those discoveries won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in terms of how nitric oxide works. So the microbiome, when they are given prebiotic fiber, which is what they like to eat, they turn that prebiotic fiber into what are now called postbiotics. And postbiotics in general are two forms. One are short-chain fatty acids like acetate and butyrate and propionate, and gasotransmitters, gasomessengers. And they're basically farts, folks. And so there's hydrogen gas, and hopefully we'll talk about hydrogen gas and Parkinson's as we go along. There's hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell. There's methane. There's carbon dioxide, which is actually a gaso-messenger. And there's nitric oxide, and I'm sure we're going to find some more. But it turns out that these gases, particularly hydrogen gas, is the smallest molecule there is and is instantly diffusible through the wall of our gut. And these gases literally are a trans-kingdom communication system between the microbiome and primarily our mitochondria, but also in terms of activating or deactivating genes. So they're epigenetic signaling molecules. And the discovery of this, I think, is so exciting to give another piece that's missing into why our modern lifestyle and why our diets, which are devoid of fiber for the most part because of our processed foods, have number one, starved our microbiome, have number two, deprived our microbiome of the ability to produce these postbiotic signaling molecules. And again, it's another piece of this puzzle. So yeah, the language has been discovered, and it's so exciting, actually. Nerdy exciting, but
You know, I want to simplify that just for a moment, just for not only the clarity of it, but how important it is. What you're saying is that our bacterial organisms living within and upon us are actually, through these messengers that you've just described, regulating the
yep.
expression of our life code. Think about that. I mean, when we're thinking about whether, should we eat this food or should we eat a food that's higher in fiber, that taking care of our gut microbiota allows them to regulate in a more salubrious fashion the expression of our inherited life code. That's pretty heady to think these little guys are changing the expression of my DNA. But when you think about that at your next meal, it makes you, I think, more likely to make better choices.
No, I think you're right. I had the pleasure of knowing Jack LaLanne in his later years, the godfather of fitness as far as I'm concerned. And I used to say all the time, Jack LaLanne's one of his favorite expressions was, if it tastes good, spit it out. And I would repeat this, and some of my staff and advisors say, "Don't say that." But you're trying to tell people, eat stuff that doesn't taste good. I said, no, that's actually not what Jack LaLanne was trying to communicate. He put it poorly. But we should, just like you said, be making our choices for our microbiome rather than this 2 by 3 inch piece of muscle that's our tongue. And if, knowing what we now know about what they want and what they will do for us, if we give them what they want to eat, it has just profound implications for our fate and our overall health.
Well, I'm going to make a bit of a segue here, but stay with me. We're talking about, let's say, some of these postbiotic messenger molecules, like you mentioned nitric oxide. And we know that uric acid inhibits the way that nitric oxide, at least endothelial enos, is able to do its job. And I was very impressed to see that in your list of recommended laboratory studies, you had uric acid on the top of that list. How did it appear there?
So I think everybody needs to realize that fructose, sorry about this, is a toxic substance. It's a mitochondrial toxin, sorry about that. It actually depletes ATP production by mitochondria in the liver, and we can go down that path. But so fructose is such a toxin that about 70% of fructose is absorbed directly through the portal vein and goes to the liver for, quote, detoxification. And it's detoxified into two compounds, uric acid and triglycerides. Now, triglycerides had a huge benefit. My studies at Yale as an undergraduate were in great apes and their ecology. And great apes only gain weight once a year during fruit season. Believe it or not, fruit only ripens once a year in the jungle. And they convert the fructose that they eat into triglycerides that they then store as fat. In fact, fun fact, a female orangutan goes on a 5,000 calorie a day fruit diet for about 6 weeks. She gains about 7 to 8 pounds, and then she goes into heat, estrus. And that's when she has enough weight to have a baby. So we follow this rule. So fructose in a limited time period was a very useful thing for us to store fat. But its other consequence is uric acid. And you're right, uric acid is one of the best ways to stop nitric oxide from working. So I look at uric acid as a really good way of telling me and anyone who will listen, along with triglycerides, what is happening in terms of primarily fructose consumption. And fructose, sadly, is one of my 7 deadly energy disruptors, because now we have 365 days of endless summer. We have access to fruit that has been bred for sugar content. A cup of seedless grapes has more sugar than an entire Hershey's candy bar now. And so, yeah, uric acid is a really good way of figuring out your fructose load, not to mention high fructose corn syrup, which is embedded everywhere. And we tend to forget that table sugar, sucrose, is 50% fructose.
So we have a gene mutation in the uricase gene, so
Correct.
we cannot break down uric acid. It lingers. It threatens via inhibiting the action of nitric oxide. It feeds back to continue the metabolism of this fructose down a pathway away from AMP kinase into AMP deaminase, which tells the body, make fat, winter's coming, and winter never comes, and we continue to make fat because it's a signal. We signal our bodies with this fructose that is, as you mentioned, everywhere, telling ourselves to make fat, increase inflammation, increase insulin resistance, and lo and behold, we see what's going on around the world. So I noticed, you mentioned this as being a powerful toxin. No need to apologize, because it really needs to be called out. When we see that close to 70% of the 2 million foods on America's grocery store shelves have added sweetener because it appeals to us. We are wired to like sweet because it was a survival mechanism. But we can override that by being smart about it and getting information like you talk about in your book. Getting back to mitochondria, one of the things you talk about is the relationship of various factors like sleep, like the timing of our eating, etc., to the notion of enhancing this mitochondrial biogenesis, basically allowing us to first rid ourselves of defective mitochondria, mitophagy, and then also create more mitochondria so that we are in a better position to utilize fuel for energy. So what can we do to target those two pathways?
So I think the second part of the book is trying to convince people and give them an option of whether we call it intermittent fasting, whether we call it time-controlled eating. I call it chronoconsumption. But the evidence is pretty overwhelming and gets more strong every year, that the more we compress our eating window to maybe 6 hours a day, which means a non-eating window of about 18 hours a day, does actually 2 things. First of all, we begin producing, if we don't have insulin resistance, after about 12 hours of not eating, we begin to start producing ketones in our liver. And rather than saying ketones are a miracle fuel for our brain, and you and I could probably talk on this for days, Ketones are actually a miracle signaling molecule for mitochondria to do two things. To signal them to actively undergo repair work and to actively duplicate themselves, mitogenesis, make more of themselves. And again, we could spend days talking about why this happens and evolutionarily why this was a good idea, but the presence of ketones after about 12 hours of fasting begins to start this process. Now, for most of us, as I lay out in the book, the vast majority of Americans are insulin resistant. And as I point out in the book, another must test, if anybody just wants a blood test, is get a fasting insulin level. And it usually shocks most people. I'll give you an example. When I first started this over 20 years ago, my fasting insulin level was 16. And we know that's insulin resistant, and I was pre-diabetic, et cetera, et cetera. Now my insulin level runs around 2. My wife runs an insulin level of less than 1. I hate her. I can't quite catch her. But so when insulin is elevated, as I talk about in the book, you can't get into ketosis. I'm sorry, folks, it's impossible because insulin suppresses hormone-sensitive lipase, which allows free fatty acids to be released from fat cells, and insulin stops that. So that's number one. We got to get out of insulin resistance. The longer you stay in a keto-producing period, up to a point, the longer you're going to stimulate mitochondria to repair themselves and to make more mitochondria. So giving mitochondria a rest is one of the best ways to enable you to make more energy when you give mitochondria something to work with. And I think we've forgotten that. The Hodzes, they don't eat breakfast. Their first meal is around 10 or 11. And usually it's when they're gathering something. So,
Well, that's when they break their fast. That's
exactly.
their break fast.
That's their
And
break fast.
They do tend to drink a little bit of blood there. So I'm not sure their diet is necessarily one that we're going to write a book about, but
No, and they actually, I mean, let's get back to them for a second. I think one of the things that's fascinating about them, and I write about this in the book, is their microbiome changes seasonally.
yes.
And dramatic shifts in a circadian rhythm seasonally. And I think we've forgotten that we should be varying our food choices on a seasonal basis. And clearly, looking at them, we were designed to do that. And the messages that are sent from this variation in the microbiome may have, implications for our, health span that we've just totally been oblivious to.
Well, there's one study, it was quite interesting, looking at the changes in the microbiome of the bear during feast and during hibernation, and how dramatically different they are. And, one wonders, is it cause or is it effect? We do know that their metabolic pathways are changed as well, going from AMP kinase to AMP deaminase depending on whether they're building fat or they're using it for oxidation or as a fuel. You do talk about how in the book that, in days gone by and probably still happening, when people would go to the doctor and complain of fatigue, sometimes they would walk out with a diagnosis of Epstein-Barr, chronic Lyme disease, or candidiasis. And I think you had a call-out box on that. And where do we stand on those diagnoses as it relates to fatigue?
Well, so I think one of the problems is because we don't have good ways to measure tiredness and fatigue, and we don't have great biomarkers for it, we're often looking for reasons to pin something on that perhaps doesn't exist. Most of us have been exposed to the Epstein-Barr virus, mononucleosis. Most of us carry, antibodies to the Epstein-Barr virus. And so for years, chronic fatigue was, pinned on Epstein-Barr virus, but the vast majority of these people didn't have active antigens of Epstein-Barr. The same way in chronic Lyme disease. I think many people working in this area, I don't specialize in it, but I certainly see plenty of people with chronic Lyme, now view this as a chronic inflammatory condition that needs to be addressed by addressing the inflammation rather than the presence or absence of these spirochetes, rather than enduring multiple rounds of antibiotics, which I think, at least in my patient population, lose their effectiveness and may actually make this inflammation worse in the long run. And finally, candidiasis. I personally have never treated someone with gut candidiasis with an antifungal drug. This is an overgrowth of a normal flora. And this flora is kept in check by all of its other competing microbiome. It's when that microbiome becomes out of balance that Candida flourishes. And as anyone who likes wine, we know that yeast likes fructose to ferment. And so many of my patients with candidiasis or candida, they're sugar eaters. They're having their fruit smoothie every day, and they're having their bagel, low-fat bagel. And when we take these simple sugars and the simple fructoses away from them, we can restore the balance. And everything, nature's got a really great balance if we wouldn't keep screwing
Well,
with it.
I've always been very taken by the notion of the healthy smoothie. Is somehow it doesn't matter what you put into the blender, because once it becomes a smoothie, then it's a smoothie and it has all these wonderful health properties. So, and same thing with fruit juice. I mean, fruit juice is a wonderful concentration of fructose, as much as you'd get by drinking a can of soda.
Yeah.
And yet it's all organic apple juice or whatever it may be, or orange juice from Florida. Sorry, I live here, and it's not that's not what our ancestors, that's not the context in which our ancestors would consume that type of fructose. It would be with fiber and polyphenols and other bioactive chemicals that would actually ultimately turn out to be positive in terms of an individual's diabetes risk, for example. Let me get back to this energetics issue as it relates to the brain. I mean, you made it pretty clear that a lot of what's going on right now is, though, in a time of caloric abundance, we are actually starving our brains for fuel.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? And more importantly, then what do we do with that?
Well, as you know, this is kind of like bringing coal to Newcastle. When I was trained, when you were trained, we somehow magically thought that the brain could use glucose without insulin. Somehow it magically happened. But we now realize that the brain is also dependent on insulin signaling to get glucose into neurons, but probably more importantly, that the brain neurons can develop insulin resistance, just like any other cell. And so there's, type 3 diabetes of the brain, insulin resistance of the brain is a very real thing. I think the other thing that we weren't as aware of, and you certainly were, is that the support system of the neurons, the microglial cells, the astrocytes, I call them the bodyguards of the brain. These are, among other things, the immune cells of the brain. And the evidence now that microglial activation by leaky gut, by inflammatory cytokines, unleashes just this torrent of neuroinflammation, which, among other things, as you know, literally eats away on the dendritic processes in an effort to protect the neuron that they're designed to defend. And we've this neuroinflammation is, among other things, in young people now showing up as brain fog. I just saw a young lady yesterday who came in from Phoenix, Arizona, 31 years old, and was former very active, very talented individual, and now she can't remember anything. And when we look at her leaky brain, she's got all this neuroinflammation. She's got her glial cells activated, and this is a healthy 31-year-old woman, and you go, wow. So, yeah, the brain has become, for most of us, insulin resistant, and what happens to most of us is that the brain is starving to death, and the brain says, where's the sugar that I need? And it literally prompts, as you and I both know in working with dementia patients, they're looking for sugar all the time. And it's really hard to stop them. My father developed Parkinson's and Parkinson's dementia, and bless his heart, he made it for 20 years without changing of a Parkinson's medication. But he had the sugar craving, and early on, he used to walk the dogs twice a day, and he'd knock on neighbors' doors in San Diego and say, hey, can I come in for a cookie? And they'd feed my dad a cookie. And we eventually went door to door and said, please don't feed the animals. And cutting him off from sugar was a full-time job for my mother, but he did well until he passed at 91. But it was this, he taught me, boy, the sugar craving is so powerful when neurons aren't working. And I'm sure you see that in your practice as well.
Yeah, and I went through something quite similar with my father
With your
and his
dad.
Alzheimer's, and the worrisome part of that is ultimately these individuals end up in some form of care facility, and are given these cans of, I don't want to name the names, but these meal replacements that are ridiculously high in sugar. It's exactly what they don't need, not only because of what you just mentioned, but the secondary effects that you described as well of ultimately enhancing insulin resistance, compromising the way that insulin works. And, we tend to want to pigeonhole things in medicine. Insulin is involved in driving sugar into the muscle cell to make glycogen. End of story. Well, no, it's a very important trophic hormone for the neuron. It nurtures the neuron. It plays a role in the neuron's ability to utilize ketones as a fuel as well. So the development of this insulin resistance plays into this whole concept of the bioenergetic theory of Alzheimer's, that guess what? It's not necessarily a consequence of the accumulation of misfolded amyloid protein. Maybe that's the secondary event. Maybe that is the brain's response to an underlying inflammatory condition or infection, and that we need to focus on the energetics. We know that we can predict now by using radionucleotide labeled glucose what parts of the brain are having deficiencies of glucose utilization. We can predict Alzheimer's a decade ahead of time. And the notion of focusing on the mitochondrial function, the energetics of the brain, is really the cutting edge of brain science. So back to your earlier statement that, hey, if you think having a fasting glucose is important, why don't you check your fasting insulin level? I wrote that in back in Grain Brain, and that raised a lot of eyebrows, because you can come home with a perfectly normal fasting glucose when your pancreas is working overtime to keep it that way, but eventually that's going to fail. Eventually, your pancreas is going to max out your insulin production, and at the same time, cells are going to say, you know what? We've had it with this insulin. We're going to shut the door. We're not going to answer the door anymore when insulin comes a knocking. And what happens is then insulin levels go up. How will you know unless you check insulin levels? So very important, and that gets right to the heart of the thesis of your book, that we can turn it around. So
Yeah.
let's talk about then what are the top choices in Gosh, I wanted to talk about sleep as well. Let's do a couple minutes on sleep because you really did a great job explaining why that's important for those walking wounded who are tired.
Well, so sleep does a lot of great things. One of the things I think is very important about sleep, first of all animals have to sleep. Sorry about that, we have to. There, during sleep, there is a brainwash cycle that you're well aware of, that I know your listeners are well aware of, where the lymphatic system, if you will, the lymphatic system of the brain does a brainwash. And there is a need for increased blood flow to accomplish this brainwash. Normally, this occurs during deep sleep, and most of the time, deep sleep happens early on in the sleep cycle. And you can track that with your Oura Ring or your Whoop band or whichever you use. And you need increased blood flow to do that. And what happens when we eat close to bedtime, all of that blood flow is down in our intestines. Digestion takes a lot of blood flow. And when we were growing up, our mothers would say, you can't go swimming for an hour after you eat because you'll get cramps and die. And there was,
How did mothers know that? They all repeated that.
yeah, well, there was a bit of truth in that wives' tale because most of your blood flow was diverted to your intestines. So it wasn't available to your big muscle groups. And in theory, yes, you could get cramps. You wouldn't die, but that's okay. But now we're realizing that you literally will get a brain cramp that if you eat too close to bedtime. And most of us try to urge people, give us 3 hours from your last food intake until you go to sleep. Number one. Number two, one of the great energy disruptors is the blue lights in our televisions, in our devices, in all of our lighting now has intense blue light. And that blue light actually served a very, very good purpose evolutionarily because during summer we would have much longer periods of blue light. We would have blue light into the late evening, and that would stimulate us to eat because that's when the food was available. And it awakens us and it makes us hungry. It turns on ghrelin. So one of the things that I really urge people is get yourself a pair of blue blocking glasses. There are a number of companies now that make them that are really good, and I mention a few in the book that I have no relationship to. Even Dave Asprey has a company now that makes them. So,
He has sent me a couple of pairs. I have them on our boat.
yeah, and or use your screens in nighttime mode. All
Right.
of these devices have them, and if I tell mothers who are nursing, get yourself a nighttime blue blocking light in the nursery, in your bedroom. You'll do yourself a favor, you'll do your baby a favor, but yeah, we've got to have a reparative process in the brain. The other thing that I think that's important, and I should have given it maybe even more importance than I did, but we think of melatonin as the sleep hormone, that melatonin rises as we go to sleep. But melatonin is actually the major mitochondrial antioxidant. And it's so important that our mitochondria actually make melatonin. And I'm beginning to think that the melatonin production has really very little to do with sleep, but it's the melatonin production that actually stimulates mitochondrial repair and mitochondrial cleanup. And that's why in the book I devote, a little nibbit of where are melatonin-containing foods. And for instance, pistachios have the highest melatonin content of any food. Coffee has melatonin. It turns out perhaps the benefit of red wine is actually in its melatonin content rather than resveratrol. Mushrooms, another great source. So melatonin, I think, is an unsung hero in all this. And the sleep and the rise in melatonin may actually coincide with this as a signal for mitochondrial repair rather than a signal to go to sleep.
Well, there's a big report this week looking at increased risk of dementia, not just cognitive decline, but actually diagnosed dementia with under 7 hours, around 6 hours or less of sleep,
Yeah.
increased risk by about 30%. Previous work that I quoted back several months ago actually found it was a U-shaped curve with increasing risk at around 9 hours or greater as well. This study actually didn't find that. They didn't really have people in the study. There was several thousand people who had extended sleep. But that said, if dementia is a neuroinflammatory condition, and these people are not sleeping enough, it could relate back to melatonin, in that we know melatonin does have some immunomodulatory role as well, which I think in the time of COVID is something worthy exploring as well. I know, I'm sure you're aware that there are interventional trials right now using really a lot higher dosage of melatonin than you and I are ever used to as an intervention once someone has been diagnosed. And I don't think we have good data on that yet, but it's going to be interesting. So before we close, give us a couple of really important tips on your top food recommendations.
So, top food, number one, I've always used to say it's not what I tell you to eat that's important, it's what I tell you not to eat. But again, I still to this day see the removal of major lectin containing foods as an important part of preventing a leaky gut. I think if people have a really great diverse microbiome like traditional societies do, these lectin-containing foods can be handled better than our society where we have a worthless microbiome, but that's a total different subject. But I think the more I can get people to get fibrous foods in their diet, particularly soluble fibers, and it's actually easier than people think. The chicory family of vegetables, radicchio, Belgian endive, for instance, curly endive. There's not a salad that I've ever gotten in the south of France or in Italy that doesn't have radicchio or curly endive in it. And it always went, why are these guys eating all this stuff? It's a great source of inulin. Asparagus, which is in season right now, another great source of inulin. Artichokes and artichokes hearts, another great source of inulin. The resistant starches, tubers. One of the interesting things is the purple sweet potato, which is now becoming fairly common in the United States. If you cook a purple sweet potato and then cool it and then reheat it, the purple sweet potato has the highest level of resistant starch that's been measured. And it also has anthocyanins, which are this phenomenal polyphenol. And really interestingly, polyphenols are of themselves prebiotics. And I think the realization that polyphenols probably exert much of their power as a prebiotic, I think is exciting reasons why we should all be trying to get more polyphenol containing foods into our diet.
I think that might help explain the so-called French paradox, that the French are eating foods that we may not think are necessarily so good for us, and yet in various metrics they seem to do better in terms of health health risk over a long period of time, well beyond resveratrol in the red wine, that the polyphenols are probably, the other polyphenols are probably playing a really important role. So it's great to talk to you. It's great to see you. And I always really enjoy our time together. Great discussion.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And it's always good to see you. And, we'll keep every now and then sending us interesting papers, if you don't mind. And I love to hear from you. So
You bet. Okay. Well, listen, great success on the new book. And I'm looking forward to talking to you soon. Bye for now.
all right. Thanks a lot.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I mean, this is really, really fundamental information. We've got to look at the whole notion of bioenergetics, how our cells utilize energy, what that means, how we fuel our bodies, how we cater to the functionality and the health of our mitochondria. So this is really important information. Again, here's the book, The Energy Paradox, by my good friend, Dr. Stephen Gundry. Hope you enjoyed the podcast today. I know I learned a lot. I'll be back soon. Thanks for joining us.